Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're continuing my series on the chronology of the life of Christ. We just had the feeding of the 5,000. Now Jesus retires to pray. We have this in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, which I will read in that sequence. First, Matthew 14, 22, and 23. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And having dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So when night came, he was alone there. I just want to say that finally Jesus manages to be alone to think and to pray. He had heard about John the Baptist being died. He wanted to get away finally. Now let's read Mark 6:45 and 46:07. Oh, I just have 46 here, actually. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after taking leave of them, he went up the mountain to pray. Here I have to say something about Bethsaida. The different accounts give different locations, or seems to. I have a long discussion, detailed discussion. My article, Bethsaida or Tiberias. You can find that in the appendix or in the new book or on my website, whatever. Now, John 6:14 and 15. Now then, having seen the miraculous sign that Jesus performed, the men said, this one really is the prophet who is to come into the world. So Jesus, perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew up the mountain again by himself, alone. Only John records this information. What will be given from verse 22 on. I take it that at least up to verse 40 here in John chapter 6, Jesus will be basically dealing with the so-called kingmakers, these men who wanted to make him king, just by the way. But first we have to go on and have Jesus walking on the water. Here again, it's Matthew, Mark, and John, only I will read them in reverse order, John, Mark, and Matthew. So first, John 6, verses 16 through 21. Now, as evening came on, his disciples had gone down to the sea, and getting into the boat, they started to go across the sea toward Capernaum. Well, it had been dark for a while, and Jesus had not come to them. Further, the sea was being agitated by a strong wind blowing. Then, after they had rowed some 3 or 4 miles, they see Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they wanted to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Several things here. Capernaum, and you get other things in other Gospels. When they started out, the boat would be pointing toward Capernaum, Gennesaret, and Bethsaida. Only as they went on would it become clear that their first destination was, in fact, Bethsaida, which was in Mark 6:45. In fact, we've already seen that. Now, here in verse 17, Jesus had not come to them. Well, that statement puzzles me. The author of this gospel, John, was in that boat. Did they really expect Jesus to come to them over the water? Oh, well, evidently they didn't expect him to come walking. I don't know what John was expecting, but anyway, there it is. We'll see later that the wind was against him. But anyway, let's look here at the 4 or 5 miles in verse 19. The Greek text actually says 25 or 30 stadia. In Matthew 14:24, we'll get there in a minute, 99% of the Greek manuscripts have them in the, quote, middle of the sea. If you draw a line from Tiberias to Bethsaida, see Mark 6:45, and put an X at 4 miles, you will be precisely in the middle of the widest part of the sea. Matthew further informs us that the wind was contrary and that Jesus came between 3 and 6 a.m. That was the fourth watch. In other words, they had been on the water at least 9 hours, and most probably rowing most of that time. And that was a fishing boat. That wasn't just a little rowboat. Well, they were tired, okay? And from the parallel accounts, it is clear that Jesus sent them on their way. In other words, he deliberately sent them into a difficult and trying situation. He knew what was going to happen. The point is that we here now need to understand that Jesus may do the same thing to us. It's happened to me more than once. Okay. Just 2 or 3 more things yet here. Verse 20, Jesus says, "It is I, don't be afraid." Only Matthew records that Peter took a little walk. We'll get there next. Then they wanted to receive him into the boat. Okay, they were ready for some help, all right? Now, the last thing here needs comment. In verse 21, immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going, in other words, Bethsaida. Okay, they were still some 4 miles from Bethsaida. So here we have another remarkable miracle. Jesus transported the boat those 4 miles instantaneously. That big fishing boat with 12 men in it, or 13. There had been repeated references to crossing the sea. So the reading of the so-called critical text, the eclectic text in Luke 9:10, that places the feeding of the 5,000 in the town of Bethsaida, is patently ridiculous. What would motivate the editors to print such a ridiculous reading in their text? Who knows? Okay, now let's go to Mark 6, verses 47 through 52. Mark. Now, when evening had passed, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he, Jesus, was alone on the land. And he saw them straining at rowing because the wind was against them. Well, about the 4th watch of the night, he comes to them, walking on the water, and would have passed by them. But they saw him walking on the water and supposed he was a ghost. And they yelled, because they all saw him, and they were terrified. Now, immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were totally astounded within themselves and kept marveling, because they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts had been hardened. A couple things here. Verse 48 says that Jesus saw them. Well, now, it was night, and they were about 4 miles away. So obviously that was supernatural vision for Jesus to see them, okay? I've already talked about the 4th watch. Let's go now to he would have passed by them at the end of 48. Yeah, but he obviously intended for them to see him. Otherwise, he would not have come near enough. Why he pretended like he was passing, I don't know. The fact is, he did not go straight at the boat, but he was walking off to one side. Well, the text doesn't say why, but from the parallel account in Matthew, we know that it gave Peter a chance to try for a walk on the water. As soon as Jesus got into the boat, it was transported 4 miles to the shore. We already talked about that. Another miracle, which you won't find in most lists, unfortunately. And here at the very end, it says their hearts had been hardened, passive voice. So the question, of course, is who did the hardening? Now we come to Matthew. I'll read verses 24 through 33. Matthew 14, but the boat was already in the middle of the sea, being harassed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they became agitated, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Courage, it is I, don't be afraid." So reacting, Peter said, "Lord, since it's you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And stepping down from the boat, Peter walked on the water to go to Jesus. But seeing the strong wind, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said to him, "You little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." A couple things here. The middle of the sea in verse 24, perhaps 2% of the Greek manuscripts of inferior quality read many furlongs away from the land, as in NIV and ASB, LV, etc. Doesn't make much difference this time. Again, we come to this fourth watch, but I have a couple more things to say. This was using Roman time, so that's how come I say it was 3 to 6. They'd had a rough night, all right. But they were still 4 miles from shore. Presumably, Jesus did not walk all that distance, but simply flew to near the boat. Look, I wasn't there, but I just assumed that. Why walk when he could fly? All right. And as I've already mentioned in John 6:21, tells us that the Lord transported the boat immediately. Wow, another really large-sized miracle, actually. Okay, we can go on now, but a couple more things I want to mention. Peter, walking on the water, he began to sink. Well, that's interesting because Peter knew how to swim. You can find that in John 21, verse 7. He swam about 100 meters to get ashore there. But he was walking on top of the water, which he'd never done before. And then, of course, the wind was scary and the water wasn't level. And all of a sudden he was wading and going down. Oh, well. Then it says here that when the Lord got into the boat, the wind ceased. Why did the wind cease? Was it a supernatural wind? In that event, who caused it? And now at the very end, the disciples worship him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Well, I guess it took a lot of convincing. But aren't we the same way? It'll take us a lot convincing. Now we come to Gennesaret, and this is only in Matthew and Mark, which I will read in that sequence. Matthew 14:34 through 36. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent messengers into all that surrounding region, and they brought to him all who were sick, and they would beg him that if only they might at least touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched were completely healed. I just want to comment one thing here. It's the spelling of the name. The best line of transmission that I am following, Family 35, along with about 30% of the Greek manuscripts. Also the Targum, by the way. spells the name with just one N. However, 70% of Greek manuscripts have two N's, as in Septuagint and most versions. Just by the way, it doesn't make any difference really. Now let's go on to Mark chapter 6, verses 53 through 56. Same thing. And after they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. When they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, and running about that whole surrounding region, they began to carry about on their pallets those who were sick to wherever they heard that he was. Wherever he entered, into villages, towns, the countryside, they would place the sick in the marketplaces. They would beg him that they might touch the hem of his garment, and all who touched him were healed. Just by the way, both of them say they crossed over. That's between Bethsaida and Gennesaret. Now, this bit about touching the hem of the garment. That didn't happen all the time, but it did happen generally with Jesus. That was really something. Later on, it happened with Paul a little bit, and Peter after the resurrection, his shadow, but those are just sort of once at a time occasions. Now we're going to go to Capernaum, and there's going to be a considerable discourse there, but first we need to pick up verses 20. This is only in John chapter 6. We need to pick up John 22 through 25, which will continue with those kingmakers. Verses 22, 25, the next day the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea, having seen that there was no other boat there except the one into which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not gotten into the boat which his disciples, or with his disciples, but only his disciples had gone away, although other boats had come from Tiberias near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So then the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there. They got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you get here? For the moment, it says here, they had stayed on the other side of the sea. They stayed near Tiberias. The other boat, there wasn't any other boat. That's because when Jesus arrived, there was only the boat he came in. And that boat, of course, with all the disciples, the fishing boat, had gone with the disciples and not with Jesus. Now, at the time of the feeding of the 5,000 men, we read there that there were little boats from Tiberias. And those had doubtless gone home to spend the night, like the town was nearby, and then the owners would want to be asleep in their beds, okay? But the next morning, their curiosity took them back. And we'll see if this comes into play here. That's what it says here, verse 23. Other boats had come from Tiberias. That was the next morning. So when the crowd, that's the kingmakers, the men who had slept on the shore there, neither Jesus nor disciples were there, and they got into the boats, those little boats, and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. I ask, how many people could those little boats from Tiberias carry? Well, probably less than 100 altogether. So the point I'm making is that those men were special people who had stayed on the scene for a reason. And we've already read, they wanted to make Jesus king, okay? Now, they found Jesus in Capernaum. That means that Jesus had already gone to Bethsaida, and then to Gennesaret, and from Gennesaret to Capernaum. Now, they crossed from Bethsaida, but now from Tiberias to Gennesaret, Capernaum was also crossing about 10 or more miles across the mouth of the big bay. We've already talked about that. But I need to ask you or mention, why would Jesus' disciples go to Bethsaida? That was really, seems totally unnecessary, because immediately they went back to Gennesaret, because the next day Jesus in Capernaum, okay, and they spent the night crossing it. Well, it was all real quick. I imagine that Jesus and the disciples went to Bethsaida. We've already seen that the owners of the place near Tiberias were in Bethsaida. They had to give an account. 15,000 people can make quite a mess. Just think about that. Well, there need to be a lot of bushes around. I suspect, I wasn't there, but I just imagine that Jesus had permission to use that place when he wanted to get away. But no one had foreseen a crowd like that. So I feel that Jesus had to give them an account, explanation. When they found him on another side, it's not the other side, another side, because it wasn't crossing the whole sea. Notice that those men then ask at the very end, when did you get here? Now, we might have expected them to say, how to know? Why? Because they knew that Jesus could have taken a back trail and gotten there on foot, no problem. So they didn't ask how, but they did ask when. Because they had slept on the beach and they'd gone by boat. So, all right. Now, next video, God willing, we'll start with his discourse. That's some very interesting things. But for this time, that's it. Thanks for watching, and God bless.